Time has expired. Mr. Grossman, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
First of all, I'd like to thank all you for being here today. I want to explore a little bit what is behind this drive for so-called diversity, or this tremendous obsession with where one's ancestors come from. As I understand it, and we can ask really either one of you here, as I understand it, the drive for diversity is based on forms that people fill out as to what their ancestry is. If, for example, I have a Peruvian grandmother and was raised in a northern suburb here, I could fill out a form and say I'm so-called Hispanic, correct? And for diversity purposes, I would be labeled Hispanic, correct?
Who did you ask? I'm sorry.
Okay, we're here talking about diversity, and that diversity is defined ethnically, okay, by where somebody's ancestors came from, correct?
Yeah.
Okay, which means, for example, that if I apply to college and I have a grandmother who was from South America, I could check on the form that I am Hispanic, correct?
That is
Mr.
correct.
Grossman, I think people are saying, to whom are you addressing your question?
To Mrs. Summon there.
Yeah.
Yes.
Right? And could you explain to me, because they say what they're looking for here is diversity. Now, I may have never been south of the border. I may not know a word of Spanish, but I'm filling out the form that I'm Hispanic. What type of diversity would I be bringing to that institution? Or how would the fact that I had a Peruvian grandmother give me a different viewpoint that would enrich that institution?
So I think you've put your finger on something very important, which is that universities have tended to emphasize skin color or ethnic diversity over true diversity of thought.
Is there any diversity there at all? I mean, that's what I don't understand. If I have a Peruvian grandmother who, for all I know, died before I was born, the whole edifice is built on the idea that, therefore, I am going to bring a different viewpoint or something to the university.
I agree that it is very concerning that many universities seem to have relied on crude stereotypes rather than looking at true individuality and at the full depth of an individual's experience and what they cast as diversity. Universities should care about individuals and individuality rather than reducing students to their ethnic or racial identities. I'm glad the Supreme Court ruled the way it did so that we can get back to a focus on treating individuals as individuals.
Okay. Elizabeth Warren, when she wanted to become a professor at Harvard, she claimed that she was apparently partly Native American, apparently on the idea that, therefore, she'd bring a different viewpoint to the faculty lounge. Could you even imagine wildly why she should get preferences for that job based on presumably a different viewpoint in the world, or something that she would know that other students would not know?
So I'm not familiar with the details of how Senator Warren views her identity. However, I agree that it's concerning that these preferences tend to reduce individuals to stereotypes rather than looking at the full range of what they bring to the table as individuals.
Does anybody that you know in their own life, when they have to make own hiring decisions, a doctor, a dentist, an accountant, anybody take into account people's ethnic background, or even ask what their ethnic background is?
I agree that that would be unusual, and that for many individuals should value competence or what they bring to the job in their role as doctor or dentist rather than racial stereotypes.
Mr. Squires, could you comment on that? I mean, this idea that somebody's view of the world is based on where their ancestors came from and that they're a monolith. Could you comment on that?
Sure. I mean, it's unfortunate that we have taken that perspective. This is one of the reasons why I believe, quite frankly, many black conservatives are easy targets in the media, is because the moment they say things that sort of the progressive left don't agree with, they're attacked.
Is that part of the problem too? Is this a pretext design to force people of a certain ancestry to allow them to be promoted based on their ideology? I mean, I can think of an example that I have heard of in my own life in just employment, where somebody was a person of color, let's say, and they were therefore educated that they should have a certain viewpoint because they're of that ancestry. Is that part of the motivation here?
A very quick answer.
Well, I'll say this in general. I do not define diversity as having people of different skin colors who all think the same. So to the extent that post-secondary institutions want to promote diversity, I think diversity of ethnic background is fine, diversity of region, but it's particularly diversity of thought. I think those should be their goals, and not just the color composition of the classroom.
Thank you. I'd like to now recognize Mr. Gerald Paul.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Race-conscious admissions was a critical tool for diversifying classrooms, for reducing racial bias, and addressing racial disparities in enrollment for students of color. Right-wing activists unfortunately waged a decades-long challenge to the use of race, and unfortunately they succeeded when the Supreme Court struck down this tool for achieving diverse classrooms by ending race-conscious admissions policies. My home state of Washington has had its own affirmative action ban, unfortunately, since 1998, restricting public colleges and considering race as an admissions factor. Despite the ban, half of Washington public college students are of color and just as diverse as their private college counterparts. One way that our Washington public colleges did this is through their guaranteed admissions policy. These policies promise seats to eligible students from local high schools if they meet grade or other academic requirements. It's not unique to my state. Colleges throughout the country have adopted similar policies without standardized testing requirements. Mr. Hinojosa, there may not be a policy that can help achieve racial diversity at the same level that race-conscious admissions has, but why are policies that eliminate reliance on testing helpful in diversifying student bodies?
Thank you, Congresswoman. So first, you have to know a little bit about standardized testing, right? They are incredibly biased instruments. They were started way back based on eugenic science, which has obviously been, dismissed by the scientific community. They're poor predictors of college success and college readiness, so there's no real connection to that. And they're basically or essentially your test score is predicted based on your zip code and the quality of education that you've received, or your socioeconomic status, I should say, rather than any other quality that an applicant would cover. So I think it's imperative that universities, especially in light of the ban, which has always been followed with substantial drops in students of color, that they consider race-neutral alternatives as those in Washington State, because those are trying to take students for where they're coming from. The high schools, there's lots of inequality still in K-12 education across all states. And I think it's imperative that they look to solutions that allow students to still show up with their talents and experiences and the like, and not just reduce them to a single test score as though that tells something about their talents.
Very important. It's interesting, but guaranteed admissions have even shown to help students graduate debt-free. For example, Washington State University has a guaranteed admissions policy, and their low-income students can attend tuition-free with our Washington College Grant. Supporting students in that way, I feel like, should be nonpartisan, should be bipartisan, but instead the same right-wing organizations behind the affirmative action decision have also waged attacks against guaranteed admissions. They claim it could be a form, get this, of race-based discrimination. But are you aware of any of these policies considering race as an admission factor?
Absolutely not. I mean, whether or not there's intentions to further diversify across socioeconomic status, across first generations, across language, et cetera, there's lots of qualities that even rural communities as well. I'm most familiar with Texas's top 10% plan because I was at MALDEF for many years and worked on both policy and litigation around the Texas top 10%, and that has helped improve. Sometimes it doesn't work as well, and this is how and why universities need the resources to be able to explore exactly how these race-neutral alternatives may impact it. But these absolutely have nothing to do with racial discrimination. They're not treating any individual differently based on their race.
And in fact, your witnesses next to you have been arguing for not reducing people down to one factor. Seems like standardized testing should not be a factor that people get reduced down to. Alternative admissions policies do not sound like a veiled racial quota like some on the right allege. In fact, guaranteed admissions seem to be the same type of race-neutral policies that these activists claim to want in a post-secondary education. Today, a witness argued that black students are harmed by policies that promise to uplift them, but instead result in mismatching them into academically challenging programs. As selective colleges reflect on their role in ensuring racial representation, should they be concerned about creating pipelines for underrepresented students in their competitive programs?
Absolutely, they should. If we're supposed to think of our universities as engineering, economic opportunity for all, then those universities need to be open to those students. And the whole mismatch theory has already been debunked by real science. That soft science has been dismissed repeatedly by peer-reviewed studies and really shouldn't be echoed in any chamber.
Real science, what a concept. I yield back.
Thank you so much. I'd like now to recognize Ms. Stefanik.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Supreme Court correctly decided Students for Fair Admission versus President and Fellows of Harvard College when they held that Harvard College's admissions did not comply with the principles of the Equal Protection Clause embodied in the Civil Rights Act. Now, Ms. Soman, previously, Grutter versus Bollinger assumed that race would be only treated as a plus in the admissions process, but we saw at Harvard that in some cases this was treated as a minus. Is this correct?
Yes.
And can you expound upon that?
Absolutely. So when there are only a limited number of seats available at any given university, it's inevitable that a plus factor for some students will be a minus factor for others.
And particularly as a Harvard College graduate, I'm very concerned that in 2013, Harvard's own Office of Institutional Research concluded that the university system was indeed biased with negative effects in the admissions process. And isn't it a fact, Ms. Soman, that they buried this report?
Yes.
I have concerns in the wake of the Supreme Court's decision. In one of the mailings that was sent out to alumni, the headline was Harvard United in Resolve in face of Supreme Court's admissions ruling. Do you have concerns about the compliance of the Supreme Court decision at some universities?
Well, I'm not familiar with that particular mailing from Harvard. I have seen similar statements from the heads of other university officials. In an amicus brief filed in support of the Coalition for TJ Cert petition, the Cato Institute documented many such examples of evasions, so I'm very concerned about lack of compliance, yes.
And how would you identify potential lack of compliance?
So statements from university officials would certainly be concerning. Changes in policy that don't seem to make sense in light of academic qualifications, but that instead seem targeted at engineering a particular racial composition, I would be concerned about.
Mr. Squires, I wanted to turn to you. In your testimony, you mentioned that it's universities themselves that benefit, not the students, from race-based discrimination. How does Harvard and how do other schools actively maintain internal incentives to keep discriminatory policies in place?
Well, what I meant by that is that oftentimes universities will particularly focus, for instance, on the incoming class, the freshman class, and talk about how diverse it is. And part of the reason is because they want to receive the social benefits that come with being able to say, you know, look at all the black and brown students we have. But again, there's a lot less emphasis on the graduating class. So this happens oftentimes when individuals will say they are choosing a particular candidate for a particular position based on race and sex. And what it does, it saddles that person with the burden of feeling as if they're not being judged by their qualifications. and allows the person doing the choosing to say how virtuous they are because of how progressive they are.
And Mr. Squires, how will the end of discriminatory race-based admissions help the next generation of college applicants?
I think one of the things that it would do is allow everyone on campus, ideally, to be able to understand that we are all here because we're based on the same set of qualifications. I can guarantee you that if in 2043, the highest performing students on the SATs and in terms of grades were Black and Hispanic, no one on the other side of the aisle would say that too many of them are going to Harvard and Yale. So if we believe in equality, it has to be equal across the board, which means everyone has to be judged by the same set of standards. If we want to consider socioeconomic status, that has to be the same across the board. But what we can't do is say, for one group of students, you can come in at this particular bar, and for another group of students, you have to come in at a much higher bar.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. And I'd like to recognize Ms. Bonamici.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to start by just noting that one of the witnesses contended that although qualified Black applicants at highly selective schools have earned their place, they are a small number of the total Black applicants who are admitted. And I'd like to enter into the record an article by Forbes titled "Black Harvard and Princeton Students Graduate at Higher Rates Than Their Classmates Overall and Equally at Yale." The article highlights Department of Education data that shows that 99% graduation rate for Black students at Harvard compared to 98% for all students, a 99% graduation rate for Black students at Princeton compared to 97% of bachelor's degrees seekers overall, and 98% of Yale students graduate within 6 years, exactly the same for Black Yale students. I'd like to enter that into the record, Mr. Chairman.
Oh, yes, with no objections.
Mr. Chairman, our nation's colleges and universities play a key role in preparing people for the jobs of today and the jobs of the future. They're an important part of preparing, for example, the highly qualified workforce we need to maintain our nation's technological leadership and advance our national security interests. And in all of these areas, we benefit from a multiracial and multicultural student population that brings a wide range of perspectives and life experiences, including at elite colleges and universities. And in fact, Chief Justice Roberts noted this in his point in the opinion in Students for Fair Admissions, saying that race-based admissions programs at military academies could further compelling interest at such academies. Mr. Zhao, do you agree that there's a range of factors to consider in advancing the United States national security interests and its global economic and technological leadership, including preparing a workforce that reflects our nation's racial and ethnic diversity? And that's a yes or no question.
I think number one, the colleges should promote the diversity of ideas, right? Students benefit from that. Also, our nation will benefit recruiting the best and brightest and give them best education.
Yeah, I'm going to reclaim my time, and I just want to enter into the record again, Mr. Chairman, excerpt from an amicus brief submitted in the case by major American companies, including American Airlines, GE, GM, Intel, Johnson & Johnson, and others, titled "American Businesses Rely on Universities to Create a Pipeline of Diverse Leaders Equipped with the Skills to Thrive in the Global Marketplace."
No objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Zhao, in your written testimony, you mentioned your concerns with unfair admissions practices such as legacy preferences, and I'm glad we share that concern. But you also mentioned that legacy preferences are driven by, and I quote, racial equity ideologies. Are you aware that legacy students are disproportionately white? For example, 7 in 10 at Harvard. That's a yes or no question.
That is a historic fact, I believe.
Okay, thank you. And I want to follow up on Mr. Takano's line of questioning, Mr. Zhao, because you discussed meritocracy several times. In your testimony, you talk about restoring meritocracy and do not destroy meritocracy. But you appeared to define that meritocracy based on test scores and grades. The dictionary definition of meritocracy means based on ability and talent rather than wealth or social position. So I submit that many people have tremendous ability and tremendous talent and potential and might not have high test scores or high grades. So it seems like it's sort of counter to what you're saying, and I wholeheartedly reject the notion that meritocracy and racial diversity are somehow exclusive, and saying so is sort of tantamount to claiming that Black and brown students aren't academically talented enough, or as Mr. Squires claims, mismatched. Now that view ignores a whole range of assets, experiences, and perspectives that Black and brown students bring to our nation's colleges and universities. And in fact, do you know what the PISA scores are, the international test scores?
Yeah, I think, Congresswoman, you misinterpreted my statement. I was saying, the test score should be one of the key criteria.
Yeah, I understand that that's what you're saying. I'm reclaiming my time, and I just want to note. I'm reclaiming my time, Mr. Zhao. I just want to note for the record that in countries with high PISA scores like China, South Korea, Singapore, they're pretty low on entrepreneurial skills, but in the United States, where we might on PISA scores have lower test scores, we have higher confidence in entrepreneurial skills. I think that's important to keep in mind. Real quickly, Mr. Hinojosa, based on your understanding of the Supreme Court opinions, would targeted outreach and recruitment policies and other policies that are outlined in the recent joint guidance from the Department of Education and Justice run afoul of the opinion, as some of my colleagues have claimed?
Are they prohibited?
Would they run afoul of the opinion?
Absolutely not.
Thank you, and I appreciate that, and I'm just about out of time, so